A man in a black cassock walks through the devastated streets of Warsaw in 1943. Nazi soldiers stand on every corner, machine guns aimed, suspicious eyes scanning every movement. This man is not carrying a Bible in his hands. He is carrying something far more dangerous. Beneath the sacred fabric of his cassock, strapped against his body with improvised bands, are dozens of ammunition cartridges, hand grenades, and detonators. If a German soldier decided to search this priest, the sentence would be immediate: public execution in the street, without trial, without mercy. But he keeps walking. His face shows no fear. His steps are measured, calm, almost ceremonial. To any observer, he is just another Catholic priest making his rounds through the rubble of a destroyed city. But beneath that cassock, he carries enough firepower to arm an entire resistance cell for a week. This is not a Hollywood invention. This is not creative license. This happened. And the man doing this was not a soldier who disguised himself as a priest. He was a real priest, ordained by the church, sworn to peace and non-violence. His name was Father Józef Stanek, and between 1939 and 1945, he became one of the most prolific weapons smugglers in occupied Poland. The Gestapo hunted him for years. They knew someone was moving guns, ammunition, and explosives right under their noses in the heart of Warsaw. They interrogated priests, they raided churches, they set traps, but they never caught him. And the reason they never caught him reveals something extraordinary about the nature of resistance during World War II. Most people think of resistance fighters as soldiers in the woods, partisans with rifles, saboteurs blowing up train tracks at midnight. And yes, those people existed. But the true backbone of resistance in occupied Europe was not armed fighters. It was ordinary people who made a choice: teachers, doctors, factory workers, and priests, especially priests. Because in a world where the Nazis controlled everything, where neighbors informed on neighbors, where a single wrong word could get your entire family sent to a concentration camp, priests had one advantage no one else had. They were trusted. They moved freely between neighborhoods. They had access to churches, basements, confessionals, and most importantly, German soldiers, even the most fanatical ones, hesitated before searching a man of God. Father Stanek understood this better than anyone. He was not a natural rebel. Before the war, he had been a quiet parish priest in a small town outside Warsaw, known for his sermons on humility and forgiveness. But when the Germans invaded Poland in September of 1939, something shifted inside him. He watched as his parishioners were rounded up, as Jewish families were dragged from their homes, as young men were executed in the streets for the crime of looking a German soldier in the eye. And he made a decision. If the Nazis believed priests were harmless, he would use that belief as a weapon. By 1940, Father Stanek had made contact with the Polish Home Army, the largest resistance organization in occupied Europe. They had fighters, they had courage, but they did not have guns. The Nazis had confiscated every weapon in Poland. Possessing a single bullet was a death sentence. So the Home Army needed smugglers, people who could move weapons from secret caches in the countryside into the hands of fighters in the city. And Father Stanek volunteered. Not because he loved violence, but because he believed that sometimes saving lives required risking your own. The first time he strapped a pistol beneath his cassock and walked past a German checkpoint, his hands shook so badly he thought he would drop it, but the soldiers waved him through without a glance. And that was the moment Father Stanek realized he had found his calling in this war. For the next 5 years he would walk through hell wearing the armor of faith, carrying death in his hands and saving the lives of hundreds. Warsaw in 1939 was one of the most vibrant cities in Europe. Over 1 million people lived there. Jews, Catholics, and Protestants shared neighborhoods, owned businesses together, sent their children to the same schools. The city had theaters, cafes, universities, bookstores that stayed open until midnight. It was a place where intellectuals debated philosophy over coffee, where jazz music drifted from nightclub windows, where young couples walked along the Vistula River on summer evenings. Father Stanek's church, St. Michael's, stood in the Wola district, a working-class neighborhood filled with factory workers, shopkeepers, and their families. On Sundays, the pews were packed. On weekdays, children played soccer in the church courtyard, while their mothers hung laundry on lines strung between buildings. It was ordinary life, beautiful, mundane, and fragile. Then came September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 in the morning, German bombers appeared over Warsaw. The sound was unlike anything the city had ever heard, a mechanical roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Within hours, entire neighborhoods were on fire. The Luftwaffe targeted not just military installations, but residential areas, hospitals, and schools. The message was clear. This was not a war between armies. This was a war against the Polish people themselves. By the end of September, after weeks of relentless bombardment and a siege that left the city without food or water, Warsaw surrendered. German troops marched through the streets in perfect formation, their boots echoing off the rubble. And within days, the occupation began in earnest. The Nazis did not simply conquer Poland, they set out to erase it. Polish language was banned in schools. Universities were closed. Intellectuals, priests, and teachers were rounded up and shot. The goal was not just control, but annihilation of Polish identity itself. In Warsaw, public executions became routine. Every morning, people woke up to find bodies hanging from lampposts with signs around their necks. Traitor, partisan, smuggler. The message was unmistakable. Resistance meant death, not just for you, but for everyone you loved. Entire apartment buildings were burned to the ground if a single resident was suspected of anti-German activity. Families were sent to concentration camps for hiding a loaf of bread meant for Jewish neighbors. Fear became the only law. Father Stanek watched his parishioners disappear one by one. Mrs. Kowalski, who brought flowers to the church every Sunday, was taken because her son was suspected of listening to BBC radio. Mr. Nowak, the baker who gave bread to hungry children, was executed because a German officer claimed he had been disrespectful. Entire Jewish families that Father Stanek had known for years were herded into a walled ghetto on the other side of the city, cut off from food, medicine, and hope. And the other priests, the ones Father Stanek had studied with in seminary, told him the same thing over and over: pray, forgive, endure. God will deliver justice in the next life. But Father Stanek could not accept that answer. He stood in his church one night in early 1940, alone in the darkness, staring at the crucifix above the altar, and he asked himself a question that would change everything. If Christ had lived in Warsaw under the Nazis, would he have told his followers to pray and do nothing, while children starved and innocents were murdered? Or would he have overturned the tables of the oppressors, as he did in the temple? Father Stanek did not know the answer, but he knew he could not remain silent, and so he made a choice that would either save lives or cost him his own. The Polish Home Army was not like other resistance movements in occupied Europe. It was not a ragtag collection of rebels hiding in the forests. It was a full shadow government, complete with military ranks, intelligence networks, underground courts, and even a secret postal service. By 1941, it had grown to become the largest resistance organization in all of Nazi-occupied territory, with over 300,000 members. But size meant nothing without weapons. The Germans had systematically disarmed Poland after the invasion. Every rifle, every pistol, every box of ammunition had been confiscated or destroyed. Resistance fighters were reduced to using homemade explosives, stolen tools, and whatever weapons they could smuggle in from outside the country. And that is where the problem became impossible. How do you arm an underground army when the enemy controls every road, every checkpoint, every train station? The answer came from the most unlikely sources. Farmers hid rifles in haystacks and transported them on wagons under loads of potatoes. Factory workers smuggled pistol parts out of German munitions plants one piece at a time, reassembling them in secret workshops. And priests, dozens of priests across Poland, began moving weapons using the one disguise the Nazis rarely questioned: religious vestments. A cassock is a long, flowing garment. It has deep pockets. It conceals the body completely. And most importantly, searching a priest was considered disrespectful, even by the standards of the occupation. German soldiers, many of them Catholic themselves, hesitated before laying hands on clergy. That hesitation created a gap, and the resistance exploited it ruthlessly. Father Stanek's first contact with the Home Army happened by accident. A young man appeared at his church one evening in the spring of 1940, bleeding from a bullet wound in his shoulder. He had been shot during a botched sabotage operation and was being hunted by the Gestapo. He begged Father Stanek for sanctuary, knowing that churches were sometimes spared from raids. Father Stanek hid him in the basement, treated his wound with vodka and torn bedsheets, and kept him there for 3 days until the patrols moved on. When the young man finally left, he gave Father Stanek a name, a contact in the resistance, and a single sentence. If you ever want to do more than pray, find him. Father Stanek did not act immediately. He spent weeks wrestling with the decision, knowing that once he crossed that line there would be no turning back. But every day he watched more of his parishioners disappear, and finally he made the walk. The contact was a schoolteacher named Marek, a man in his 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a limp from a childhood accident. They met in the ruins of a bombed-out library, surrounded by charred books and broken shelves. Marek did not waste time with pleasantries. He asked Father Stanek one question: "Are you willing to die for Poland?" Father Stanek answered without hesitation, "Yes." Marek studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The resistance did not need another fighter. They needed smugglers, people who could move weapons from the countryside into the city without being stopped. And priests, Marek explained, were the best smugglers they had. The Germans rarely searched them. They moved freely through checkpoints. And if a priest was caught, the scandal would be so great that the Nazis might hesitate before executing him publicly. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was better odds than anyone else had. Father Stanek agreed on the spot. Within a week he was given his first assignment. A cache of pistols and ammunition had been hidden in a barn 15 kilometers outside Warsaw. His job was to retrieve it, conceal it beneath his cassock, and deliver it to a resistance cell in the city. The weapons would be used to arm fighters preparing for an eventual uprising. Marek gave him one final warning before he left. "If you are caught, we cannot save you. You will be tortured for names, then executed." Father Stanek understood. He walked out of that ruined library knowing he had just volunteered for a mission that would likely end in his death. But for the first time since the invasion, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The first smuggling run nearly broke him. Father Stanek left Warsaw before dawn on a cold morning in October 1940, traveling by bicycle along a dirt road that wound through the countryside. The city was still dark, the streets empty except for German patrols and the occasional sound of distant gunfire. He wore his black cassock, a wooden cross around his neck, and carried nothing but a small prayer book in his pocket. To anyone watching, he was simply a priest visiting a rural parish, but his heart was pounding so hard he thought the soldiers at the checkpoint could hear it. When he reached the edge of the city, 2 German guards stopped him. They asked where he was going. Father Stanek kept his voice steady and told them he was bringing last rites to a dying farmer. One of the guards studied his face for a long moment, then waved him through. That was the first test, and Father Stanek had passed. The barn was exactly where Marek said it would be, hidden behind a cluster of oak trees on the edge of an abandoned farm. Inside, buried beneath a pile of rotting hay, was a wooden crate. Father Stanek pried it open with shaking hands. Inside were 6 pistols, 4 boxes of ammunition, and 3 hand grenades wrapped in oilcloth. He stared at them for a moment, the weight of what he was about to do settling over him like a stone. These were not symbols. These were tools of death. And he, a man who had spent his entire adult life preaching peace, was about to carry them into the heart of occupied Warsaw. He forced himself to move. He wrapped the pistols in cloth, strapped them against his torso with strips of fabric, and placed the ammunition boxes into deep inner pockets sewn into his cassock. The grenades went last, tucked into a leather pouch that hung against his chest. When he stood up, the weight was immense. He could barely move without feeling the hard metal pressing into his ribs. The ride back to Warsaw was the longest 15 kilometers of his life. Every bump in the road made the grenades shift against his chest. Every passing German truck made him certain he was about to be stopped and searched. At one point, a motorcycle patrol pulled alongside him and shouted something in German. Father Stanek did not speak German well, but he understood the tone. They were mocking him, laughing at the sight of a priest on a bicycle. He forced himself to smile, to wave, to keep pedaling, and after a moment they sped off. When he finally reached the city checkpoint, the same guards from that morning were still on duty. They recognized him and waved him through without a word. Father Stanek did not exhale until he was 3 blocks past the checkpoint. Only then did he allow himself to realize what he had just done. He had smuggled enough weapons to arm 6 resistance fighters, and the Germans had not even looked at him twice. The drop-off point was a cellar beneath a butcher shop in the old town district. Father Stanek descended the narrow stairs and found 3 men waiting in the darkness. They did not give their names. They simply took the weapons from him, examined them quickly, and nodded. One of them, a man with a scar across his cheek, looked Father Stanek in the eye and said something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "These will save lives, Father, more than your prayers ever could." It was not meant as an insult. It was a statement of fact, and Father Stanek knew it was true. He made the walk back to his church in a daze. His body felt lighter without the weight of the guns, but his mind felt heavier. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a priest. He was a smuggler, a criminal in the eyes of the occupation, a target for the Gestapo. But when he reached St. Michael's and saw the families gathered outside, waiting for him to open the doors for evening mass, he felt something unexpected. Not guilt, not fear, but purpose. For the first time since the war began, Father Stanek believed he was doing exactly what God had called him to do. And within a month he would do it again, and again, and again. By the winter of 1941, Father Stanek had made over 30 smuggling runs. He developed a system, a routine that balanced caution with efficiency. He varied his routes, never taking the same road twice in a row. He memorized the schedules of German patrols, learning which checkpoints were staffed by older soldiers who waved priests through without questions and which were manned by young fanatics who searched everyone. He learned to walk with a specific posture, slightly hunched, as if weighed down by the burden of spiritual duty rather than the literal weight of weapons. And he learned the most important lesson of all: confidence was the best disguise. Hesitation drew suspicion, but a man who walked like he had nothing to hide was rarely stopped. The resistance began to rely on him. Marek gave him more complex assignments. Not just pistols and ammunition, but detonators for explosives, timing devices for sabotage operations, even documents and false identification papers hidden in hollowed-out prayer books. Father Stanek became a ghost, moving through the city with a freedom that few others possessed. While resistance fighters hid in cellars and attics, while Jewish families were locked behind ghetto walls, Father Stanek walked openly through German checkpoints, nodded politely to SS officers, and delivered the tools of rebellion right under their noses. Other priests in the network called him the Shepherd, a man who guided weapons to those who needed them most. But Father Stanek never used that name. To him, he was simply doing what any decent person would do when faced with evil. But the risk grew with every trip. The Gestapo was not stupid. They knew weapons were moving through Warsaw. They knew someone was supplying the resistance, and they began to tighten their grip. Random searches increased. Checkpoints that once waved priests through began demanding identification papers, asking detailed questions about destinations and parishes. Informants were planted in churches, paid to report any suspicious behavior by clergy. Several priests in the smuggling network were arrested, tortured, and executed. Their bodies were left hanging in public squares with signs that read, "This is what happens to traitors who hide behind the cross." Father Stanek attended their funerals, said prayers over their graves, and knew that he could be next. The closest he came to being caught happened in the spring of 1942. He was returning from a run, carrying a load of grenades and ammunition, when he was stopped at a checkpoint he had passed through dozens of times before. But this time, there was a new officer in charge, a young Gestapo lieutenant with cold eyes and a reputation for brutality. The lieutenant ordered Father Stanek to step off his bicycle. He circled him slowly, studying the way the cassock hung on his frame. Then he asked a question that made Father Stanek's blood freeze. "Why does a priest need to travel so much?" Father Stanek kept his voice calm and explained that he was visiting the sick, bringing sacraments to the dying. fulfilling his duties to scattered parishes. The lieutenant did not look convinced. He reached out and grabbed the fabric of Father Stanek's cassock, pulling it tight. For a moment, Father Stanek was certain the officer would feel the hard outline of the grenade strapped to his chest. But then, something unexpected happened. An older German soldier, a sergeant standing nearby, spoke up. He told the lieutenant that this priest had been coming through the checkpoint for months, that he was known in the area, that he had even given last rites to a dying German soldier the previous winter. The lieutenant hesitated, his hand still gripping the cassock. Then slowly he let go. He told Father Stanek to leave and warned him not to travel after curfew. Father Stanek climbed back onto his bicycle, his legs shaking so badly he almost fell. He pedaled away slowly, forcing himself not to look back. Only when he was out of sight did he allow himself to breathe. That night, he sat alone in his church and realized something terrifying. Luck had saved him. Not skill, not planning, just luck. And luck, he knew, always ran out eventually. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising changed everything. In April of 1943, Jewish fighters trapped behind the ghetto walls launched a desperate rebellion against the Germans. They had almost no weapons, just a handful of pistols, homemade explosives, and Molotov cocktails. But they fought with a ferocity that shocked the Nazi command. What was supposed to be a quick liquidation of the ghetto turned into weeks of brutal urban combat. German tanks rolled through narrow streets, flamethrowers set entire buildings ablaze, and still the Jewish fighters refused to surrender. The entire city of Warsaw could see the smoke rising from the ghetto, could hear the gunfire echoing day and night. And Father Stanek, like everyone else, knew that the people fighting in there were dying for a cause that had no hope of victory. They were fighting simply because they refused to die on their knees. The Home Army wanted to help, but they were not ready for a full-scale uprising. Their plan had always been to wait, to stockpile weapons, to prepare for a coordinated rebellion when the Germans were weakest. But watching the ghetto burn changed the calculations. Resistance leaders realized that if they did nothing, if they let the Jews fight and die alone, the moral cost would be unbearable. So they made a decision. They would smuggle weapons into the ghetto, not enough to change the outcome, but enough to let the fighters hold out a little longer, to make the Germans pay for every block, every building, every life. And Father Stanek was asked to be part of that effort. Getting weapons into the ghetto was nearly impossible. The walls were 3 meters high, topped with barbed wire and broken glass. Every gate was guarded by German troops and Polish collaborators. The sewers, which had been used as escape routes in the early days of the ghetto, were now patrolled and booby-trapped. But there was one route that still worked. A drainage tunnel that ran beneath a church near the ghetto wall, connecting to a basement inside the sealed zone. The tunnel was narrow, flooded with waist-deep water, and pitch black, but it was unguarded, and Father Stanek volunteered to use it. The first time he entered that tunnel, he thought he would drown. The water was freezing, thick with sewage and debris. The ceiling was so low he had to crouch, sometimes crawl, dragging a waterproof sack filled with pistols and ammunition behind him. The darkness was absolute. He could not see his own hands in front of his face. He navigated by touch, feeling along the slimy walls, counting his steps, praying that he was moving in the right direction. The journey took over an hour. When he finally emerged on the other side, climbing up through a hidden entrance in a ruined basement, he was met by 2 Jewish fighters. They were young, maybe 20 years old, skeletal thin, their faces blackened with soot. They took the weapons without a word, and one of them gripped Father Stanek's arm with a strength that belied his frail appearance. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. Father Stanek made that journey 4 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each trip was more dangerous than the last. German patrols increased around the ghetto perimeter. The tunnel began to collapse in places, forcing him to dig through rubble with his bare hands. On his final trip, he heard explosions above him so powerful that chunks of concrete fell from the tunnel ceiling. He knew what that meant. The Germans were systematically destroying the ghetto, building by building. The fighters he was supplying were running out of time. When he emerged that last time, the basement was empty. No one came to meet him. He left the weapons there, and crawled back through the tunnel alone. 2 days later, the ghetto uprising was crushed. Nearly all the fighters were killed, but Father Stanek never regretted those trips, because those young men and women had not died as victims. They had died as soldiers, and that mattered. After the ghetto fell, the Gestapo intensified their hunt for resistant smugglers. They knew that priests were involved, and they began targeting churches with a level of aggression they had previously avoided. In May of 1943, 3 priests were arrested in a single week, all accused of smuggling weapons. They were tortured in the basement of Gestapo headquarters on Aleja Szucha, a building that became synonymous with horror in Warsaw. Neighbors could hear the screams echoing from its windows at night. The priests were executed publicly in the old town square, their bodies left hanging for 3 days as a warning. The message was clear. The Nazis no longer cared about the optics of killing clergy. If you were caught helping the resistance, your collar would not save you. Father Stanek knew his time was running out. Marek warned him to stop, to go into hiding, to leave Warsaw entirely. But Father Stanek refused. The Home Army was preparing for something big, something that would require every smuggler they had. He could not abandon them now. So he adapted. He stopped using his bicycle, which had become too recognizable. He began moving weapons only at night, during curfew, using routes through bombed-out buildings and collapsed cellars that German patrols rarely checked. He recruited 2 altar boys from his church, teenagers named Piotr and Janusz, to act as lookouts. They were too young to fully understand the danger, but old enough to know that what they were doing mattered. They would position themselves at street corners, pretending to play or scavenge for scrap metal, and signal Father Stanek if patrols were approaching. It was a fragile system, built on luck and timing. But it worked. The breaking point came in July of 1943. Father Stanek was making a delivery to a safe house in the Praga district, carrying a load of detonators hidden beneath his cassock. He had just crossed the Vistula River when he noticed he was being followed. 2 men in civilian clothes walking 30 meters behind him, matching his pace exactly. Gestapo agents, almost certainly. They were not close enough to arrest him yet, but they were watching, waiting to see where he would lead them. Father Stanek's mind raced. If he went to the safe house, he would expose the entire resistance cell there. If he turned back, he would confirm their suspicions. So he did the only thing he could think of. He walked directly into a German military checkpoint. The soldiers at the checkpoint were confused when a priest approached them voluntarily. Father Stanek, speaking in broken German, told them he needed help. He claimed he had gotten lost, that he was trying to reach a hospital to administer last rites to a dying soldier. The Germans, caught off guard, pointed him in the right direction. And while they were distracted, Father Stanek glanced back and saw the 2 Gestapo agents standing at a distance, watching. They could not arrest him now, not in front of Wehrmacht soldiers who might ask questions. Father Stanek nodded his thanks and walked away in the direction the soldiers had indicated. He wandered through the city for over an hour, making random turns, entering buildings and exiting through back doors until he was certain he had lost his tail. Only then did he return to his church, still carrying the detonators. He hid them in a hollow beneath the altar and sat in the empty pews until dawn, knowing that he had just narrowly escaped capture. But that night, lying awake in his small room behind the church, Father Stanek realized something that terrified him. The Gestapo was watching him now. They might not have proof yet, but they suspected, and it was only a matter of time before they found it. He thought about running, about disappearing into the countryside or fleeing to the Soviet-controlled territories in the east. But then he thought about Piotr and Janusz, the 2 boys who looked up to him. He thought about the resistance fighters who depended on him, and he thought about the promise he had made to Marek in that ruined library 3 years ago. He had agreed to die for Poland if necessary, and now that necessity was becoming very real. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1st, 1944. It was not a spontaneous rebellion. It was a calculated military operation planned for months by the Home Army, timed to coincide with the Soviet advance toward the city. The goal was ambitious and desperate: liberate Warsaw before the Soviets arrived, establish Polish control, and prevent the city from falling under communist domination. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, resistance fighters emerged from cellars, attics, and sewers across the city. They attacked German garrisons, seized government buildings, and raised the Polish flag over the old town. For the first time in 5 years, Warsaw was fighting back, and for the first few days, it seemed like they might actually win. Father Stanek's role in the uprising was not to fight, it was to keep the weapons flowing. The Home Army had stockpiled guns and ammunition for years, but the supplies were scattered across dozens of hidden caches throughout the city. As the battle lines shifted, as German reinforcements poured in and the fighting intensified, those caches needed to be moved, redistributed, delivered to fighters who were running out of bullets. Father Stanek became a courier in a war zone. He moved through the chaos wearing his cassock, now torn and stained with soot and blood, carrying grenades in his pockets and bandoliers of ammunition across his chest. The irony was not lost on him. For 3 years, he had hidden weapons beneath his cassock to avoid detection. Now, in the middle of an open rebellion, he wore them openly because there was no point in hiding anymore. The fighting was unlike anything Warsaw had ever seen. German tanks rolled through narrow streets, firing point-blank into buildings. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, dropping incendiary bombs that turned entire blocks into infernos. Resistance fighters, many of them teenagers with only days of training, fought from rooftops, sewers, and barricaded apartments. They used every tactic they could think of: Molotov cocktails thrown from windows, mines planted in the streets, snipers hidden in church towers. Father Stanek watched children, some as young as 12, running ammunition through streets filled with machine gun fire. He saw women dragging wounded fighters into cellars to perform surgeries with kitchen knives and no anesthesia. And he saw the dead, hundreds of them every day laid out in rows in church courtyards because there was nowhere else to put them. On August 10th, the Germans launched a massive counterattack against the Old Town, the historic heart of Warsaw and one of the resistance's strongest positions. Father Stanek was there delivering ammunition to fighters barricaded inside the ruins of the city library. The shelling was so intense that the ground shook constantly. Buildings collapsed without warning, burying fighters and civilians alive. Father Stanek watched as a young woman, no older than 20, was hit by shrapnel while running across the street. He ran to her, cradled her head, and tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much blood. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, and asked if she was going to die. Father Stanek lied. He told her she would be fine, that help was coming. She died in his arms 3 minutes later. He did not even know her name. That night, as fires raged across the old town and German loudspeakers demanded surrender, Father Stanek sat in the basement of St. Michael's Church with a group of fighters. They were exhausted, filthy, running low on ammunition and hope. One of them, a man named Tomasz, who had fought beside Father Stanek for years, asked him a question. "Do you think God is watching this, Father? Do you think he cares?" Father Stanek did not answer immediately. He looked at the faces around him, these young men and women who had sacrificed everything for a cause that was quickly becoming hopeless, and he told them the only truth he knew. "I do not know if God is watching, but I know that you are fighting for something that matters, and that is enough." It was not the answer of a priest, it was the answer of a man who had stopped believing in divine intervention and started believing in human courage. And in that moment, it was all they needed to hear. The Warsaw Uprising lasted 63 days, 63 days of street-by-street combat, of buildings turned to rubble, of civilians caught in the crossfire. The Soviets, who had been advancing rapidly toward the city, suddenly stopped on the east bank of the Vistula River. They sat there within sight of Warsaw and watched as the Germans systematically destroyed the resistance. Stalin had made a calculation. If the Home Army succeeded, Poland would remain independent. If the Germans crushed them, the Soviets could march in afterward and claim the ruins without opposition. So the Red Army waited. And the people of Warsaw died. By September, it was clear the uprising had failed. The resistance was out of ammunition, out of food, out of hope. On October 2nd, 1944, the Home Army surrendered. The Germans had won. Father Stanek survived, but barely. In the final days of the uprising, he was trapped in a collapsed building for 18 hours after a German artillery strike brought the roof down. When resistance fighters finally dug him out, his left arm was broken, his ribs were cracked, and he was coughing blood. But he was alive. The Germans, honoring the terms of surrender, allowed surviving fighters to be treated as prisoners of war rather than criminals. But Father Stanek was not a fighter in their eyes, he was a priest, and that meant he fell into a different category. The Gestapo had spent 5 years trying to prove that priests were smuggling weapons for the resistance. Now, with the uprising crushed, they finally had the opportunity to make examples of the clergy they suspected. Father Stanek was arrested on October 5th, 3 days after the surrender. Gestapo agents came to St. Michael's Church in the early morning, dragged him from the ruins where he had been helping bury the dead, and threw him into the back of a truck. He was taken to Pawiak prison, a fortress-like building in central Warsaw that had become the main detention center for political prisoners. The cells were tiny, freezing, and overcrowded. Father Stanek shared a space meant for 4 people with 11 other men. They had no beds, no blankets, no sanitation. Food was a thin soup once a day. But the worst part was not the conditions, it was the waiting. Every morning guards would call out names, those men would be taken away, and they never came back. Father Stanek waited for 2 weeks, expecting his name to be called at any moment. He prayed, not for salvation, but for the strength to face whatever was coming. He thought about the faces of the people he had helped, the fighters he had armed, the young woman who had died in his arms in the old town. He thought about Piotr and Janusz, his 2 altar boys, and wondered if they had survived. He thought about the hundreds of trips he had made, the thousands of rounds of ammunition he had smuggled, the lives that had been saved or lost because of his actions. And he came to a strange kind of peace. If this was the end, then at least it had been a life that mattered. But his name was never called. On October 23rd, without explanation, Father Stanek and several other priests were transferred out of Pawiak. They were loaded onto a cattle car with hundreds of other prisoners and transported west away from Warsaw. No one told them where they were going. The journey lasted 3 days. They had no food, no water, no space to sit. People died standing up. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, Father Stanek stumbled out into blinding sunlight and saw the gates of a place he had only heard about in whispers. Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp just north of Berlin. He was no longer a prisoner of war. He was now a political prisoner in the Nazi camp system, and the odds of survival had just dropped to almost 0. The Nazis had a special block in Sachsenhausen for clergy. It was called the Priests' Barracks, and it held over 1,000 priests, pastors, and religious figures from across occupied Europe. They were kept alive, but barely. They were used for medical experiments, forced labor, and psychological torture. The goal was not execution, it was humiliation. The Germans wanted to break the spirit of the church itself. Father Stanek spent the next 6 months in that camp, working in a stone quarry, surviving on starvation rations, watching men die of typhus and exhaustion every single day. But he did not break, because he had already faced the worst thing a person can face, the knowledge that everything he had fought for had failed. Warsaw was gone, the resistance was crushed, Poland was being divided between 2 empires, and yet somehow Father Stanek found a reason to keep living, because survival itself, in the face of absolute evil, was an act of resistance. Sachsenhausen was liberated by Soviet forces on April 22nd, 1945. Father Stanek weighed less than 50 kilograms. His hair had turned completely white. His broken arm had never healed properly, but he was alive. Of the 11 men he had shared a cell with in Pawiak prison, he was the only one who survived. When the Soviet soldiers opened the gates, Father Stanek did not celebrate. He simply walked out, 1 step at a time, and began the long journey back to Warsaw. It took him 3 weeks to make the trip, traveling on foot, hitching rides on Soviet supply trucks, sleeping in abandoned barns. When he finally reached the city in May of 1945, he did not recognize it. Warsaw was gone, not damaged, not occupied, gone. The Germans, in their final act of vengeance, had systematically demolished the entire city after the uprising. Over 85% of the buildings had been destroyed. The old town, the historic heart of Warsaw that had stood for 700 years, was nothing but rubble. The royal castle, the cathedral, the university, all reduced to piles of brick and ash. The population, which had been over 1 million before the war, was now less than 200,000. Father Stanek walked through streets he had known his entire life and could not find a single landmark. St. Michael's Church, where he had preached for 15 years, where he had hidden weapons beneath the altar, where he had made the decision to join the resistance, was a crater in the ground. Nothing remained. Not even the crucifix. He found Marek by accident, living in a makeshift shelter made from salvaged wood and sheets of metal. Marek had survived the camp system as well, though he walked with a cane now and could barely see out of his left eye. They sat together in the ruins and talked for hours, not about the war, but about the people they had lost. Tomasz, the fighter who had asked Father Stanek if God was watching, had been executed by the Germans after the surrender. Piotr and Janusz, the two altar boys, had both died in the final days of the uprising, killed by artillery fire while running messages between resistance positions. Of the dozens of priests in the smuggling network, only 4 had survived. The rest had been executed, died in camps, or simply disappeared. The cost of resistance, Father Stanek realized, was not just the dead. It was the knowledge that most of their sacrifice would never be recorded, never be remembered, never be honored. Father Stanek spent the rest of his life rebuilding, not just Warsaw, though he helped with that too, clearing rubble and laying foundations for new buildings, but rebuilding the memory of what had happened. He wrote everything down, every smuggling run, every name he could remember, every act of courage he had witnessed. He testified at war crimes trials, identifying Gestapo officers who had tortured priests. He fought to have the resistance officially recognized by the new Polish government, though the communists, now in control, were reluctant to honor a movement they had not led. And he returned to the priesthood, not because he had regained his faith in divine intervention, but because he believed the church could still be a force for good in a broken world. He died in 1976 at the age of 73 in a small apartment in reconstructed Warsaw. By then, the city had been rebuilt, though it would never be the same. His funeral was attended by over 2,000 people, many of them former resistance fighters, former prisoners, people whose lives he had touched in ways they could never fully explain. But his story, like so many stories from occupied Poland, was not widely known outside of Poland itself. The Cold War had rewritten history. The West focused on D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the fall of Berlin, the suffering of Eastern Europe. The resistance movements that had fought alone for years were footnotes, and that is the tragedy. Father Józef Stanek smuggled enough weapons to arm hundreds of resistance fighters. He risked his life over 100 times. He survived torture, imprisonment, and a concentration camp. He helped save lives in a time when simply staying alive was an act of defiance. But his name does not appear in most history books. There are no movies about him, no monuments, just a small plaque on a rebuilt church in Warsaw that most people walk past without noticing. Because the quiet heroes, the ones who did not seek glory but simply did what needed to be done, are always the first to be forgotten. But their actions echo forward. Every bullet Father Stanek smuggled, every fighter he armed, every life he saved, was a refusal to let evil win unopposed. And in a world that desperately needs to remember that ordinary people can stand against tyranny, his story matters now more than ever,